Hello and welcome. I am Katita from Yo Soy Fermentista, and today I have a very special guest, Morely Robbins. He is a man who has devoted the last 10 years or maybe even more to investigating truths about health that maybe other people have investigated, or I would say you're putting pieces together of a health puzzle to help all of us understand better how is it that our bodies work, because our bodies are so beautiful and intelligent and divine, and they're designed to work beautifully. And so we all are designed to be healthy and vibrant and have energy.
Right.
And yet most of us in the modern world, we don't feel healthy or vibrant, and we don't have energy. And so we're going to talk today about Morley's work, which has a lot to do with minerals, specifically iron, copper, and magnesium. And there's a lot to go into. So I think we'll start off, Morely, by giving you the chance to introduce yourself and tell us how you came to investigate and learn all of these things that you've learned about minerals. And then we're going to dive into some topics that are important.
That's great. Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Katie. This will be a fun conversation. A real quick thumbnail sketch. I was born into a very sickly family. My sister decided she was going to be a nurse, and well, that meant I was going to become the doctor. And I wasn't the student, I wasn't the academic then that I am now. And so that was not going to be in the cards. But I chose to go into hospital management and hospital consulting, and did that for 32 years. My area of focus was on the planning and marketing side, helping to forecast demand for services, helping to design new programs, what kind of hospital is needed. That's pretty good at it. What's fascinating now is my goal is to close hospitals as fast as I can. So I've come full circle. But 12 years ago, after 20 years of dragging a suitcase behind my back through airports all over the country, I developed what's called frozen shoulder. Like I couldn't pick my hand up above my waist. Tremendous pain, couldn't sleep, went to a health food store and explained what my problem was. And they said, well, you need to go see Dr. Liz. Well, I knew right away that was a chiropractor. I said, look, I don't do witchcraft. Just give me some supplements. That didn't work at all. Went back a couple months later, and the owner of the store said, Morely, we love you. Go see Dr. Liz. And so it was a transformational experience. With just a couple of treatments, I was able to have full rotation and mobility of my shoulder that had locked up months and months before. And she used a phrase in that first encounter that I'd never heard before in 32 years of working in the hospital setting. She talked about the innate healer, the healer within, the wisdom within. And I looked at her, I didn't say anything. I was thinking to myself, if there's an innate healer, why do we have millions of doctors around the world? It didn't make sense to me. So I decided to set out and discover who is this innate healer. And it's been a fascinating journey for the last 12 years. For those that may know of my initial work, I focused on magnesium, the magnesium burn rate, which accelerates as we're under stress. And through that process, discovered that there's something called iron, very important metal, which we'll talk about. Well, iron doesn't play nicely with oxygen. It creates what's called oxidative stress. we can call that metabolic exhaust. And it took me probably 7 years to understand what was going on with iron and oxygen. Well, it was because of a lack of bioavailable copper. And that then became the real primary focal point of my work, was to really get behind that and understand what copper is, what it does, how it's affected by stress, both acute and chronic. And the real primary purpose is to get energy, create energy. And what I really encourage people to do is to ignore the enemies, the bugs, the pathogens, the toxins that all the practitioners focus on, and ignite the energy. And once the body has energy, it knows exactly what to do. Mm-hmm. It takes energy to clear the toxins. It takes energy to clear the pathogens. And so it's a completely different structure and function and a philosophical approach than you find in mainstream and in many alternative programs. So it's just a very different philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is interesting. So your doorway into all of this was magnesium, as you said, and then you discovered, oh wait, iron is a part of the picture too, specifically in how it reacts to and relates to oxygen. And then now this kind of puzzle piece that we're all missing is copper, which I think, yeah, most people are thinking like, well, no one's ever talking about copper. I mean, a lot of people are talking about magnesium. Some people are talking about iron, but no one's talking about copper. So it's going to be interesting to get into that. I do want to start with iron, though, specifically because my audience is primarily from Latin America and also some from Spain. Okay. And these are places where anemia tends to be, especially with lower income populations, anemia tends to be a diagnosis that's given quite frequently. And people are given iron supplements, or people are maybe given foods that are fortified with iron. A lot of modern foods, like even wheat, are fortified with iron. And what would we tell? I guess here's what I want to say. Like someone from the US who has access to a lot of meat, they could still be diagnosed with anemia, but is that going to be different from someone in Latin America who doesn't have access to that good quality food and is diagnosed with anemia? I just know that it's a big deal in Latin America.
It's a big deal worldwide. It's the number one nutrient deficiency on planet Earth. But it makes no sense at all. Mm-hmm. The number one element on planet Earth, 34% of the Earth's composition is iron. Mm-hmm. And prior to 2020, I would have said that humans were the most evolved species on the planet. Now I'm not convinced, but it would suggest that the most evolved species can't metabolize the number one element on the planet. Well, that doesn't pass any sniff tests at all. It just makes no sense. And so when you get into the research, you find out that in the world of traditional Chinese medicine, copper is referred to as the general, and iron is referred to as the foot soldier. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to be a soldier to know there's a difference between a general and a foot soldier. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot fewer generals in the army than there are foot soldiers. Here in the States, there's actually 242 generals by law in the army, but there's 440,000 foot soldiers. Mm-hmm. Wow. That's a big difference. But those 242 generals run the show, right? They dictate all the policy and they dictate the programs. And so it works the exact same way in our body. There's an average adult has 100 milligrams of copper. That fits on the head of a 1-inch stick pin. It's a little tiny bit of copper. But the amount of iron is ostensibly 5,000 milligrams. Well, that's 50 to 1. It's an enormous differential. And yet all the spotlights and optics are on iron. No one talks about copper. And if they do talk about copper, they say, oh, well, copper is toxic. And that everyone's anemic, right? Iron's anemic, copper's toxic. And we live in very different times, or at least we're now waking up to that, and everything's backwards. When in fact, the real status is copper is missing in the diet and iron is stuck in the tissue. Now, let me explain what I mean. There's a very important process of recycling iron that needs to take place all day long. Every second of every day, we need to make 2.5 million red blood cells inside our body. Every second. We've been talking now for about 10 minutes. So that's 600 times 2.5 million. That's how many red blood cells you and I have had to make. And that recycling process is run by copper. But the most important part of the recycling process is there are cells called macrophages. They're the Pac-Man of our body. They play a very instrumental role as a first line of defense in our immune system. But they also are involved in recycling dying red blood cells to get access to the iron to support this process of rebuilding red blood cells. Well, there's a doorway. There's an exit doorway in the macrophage. And that doorway is called ferroportin, iron doorway. How would you say that in Spanish? Ferroportin. How would you say that?
La puerta del hierro, like the door of iron, la puerta del hierro.
And the doorman at that door, copper. It's a copper doorman. So how would you say that in Spanish? Copper doorman.
Like el guardián es el cobre, or el cobre es el guardián.
There you go. And if the copper is not present, the doorway doesn't open, the iron can't get out. And what happens is, on a blood test, iron would look low in the blood test, but it's very high in the tissue because the blood test does not measure tissue levels of iron. It's measuring what's in the blood. The blood is outside of the tissue. And doctors are trained to interpret blood tests, but they don't have access to tissue level tests because they don't exist. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about low iron in the blood. And doctors don't know that it's a seesaw function. If it's low in the blood, that means it's high in the tissue. And the reason why it's high is because the copper is missing to run that doorway to complete the recycling system. And then a lot of very bad decisions are being made based on misunderstandings about hemoglobin levels, misunderstandings about ferritin levels, and misunderstandings about serum iron. The actual iron is being transported throughout the body to go back for the recycling program. So it's really a case of a misunderstanding. And this really goes back to the 1920s. was when it was first identified. And at any given time, 1% of society is pregnant. 99% are not pregnant. And what they did was they studied pregnant women, and they noted that as the pregnancy progressed, hemoglobin levels start to drop in the pregnant woman's body. It's called hemodilution. Well, it really turns out what is happening is hemoglobin is leaving the mother's body and going to the baby's body. And Mother Nature has a reason for that, but not the least of which is the mother needs lower iron in her body so she can make more milk for the baby once it's born. And there's a very famous study that was done by Dr. Philip Steer in 1995, where he measured the hemoglobin status of 150,000 mothers and 150,000 live births to see what was the hemoglobin level that was associated with the healthiest babies. And when a woman is not pregnant, her hemoglobin should be somewhere between 12.5 and 13.5, or 125 and 135, depending upon the metrics that are being used. But what Dr. Steer found in 1995 was that the healthiest babies, those with the best birth weight, those with the highest APGAR scores, were born to mothers whose hemoglobin was between 8.5 and 9.5, or 85 to 95, which is, it's unheard of in modern obstetrics to allow the woman to get down that low, when in fact that's exactly what Mother Nature wants. Mother Nature is seeking lower iron in the mom because she knows it's not necessary, and in fact it's going to get in the way of lactation. And another important fact for people to understand is that there is no iron and there is no vitamin D in mother's breast milk. I think Mother Nature has a reason for that. But when you get your, when the milk is being supplied by synthetic forms, the amount of iron that's in there is 40 times what it should be. The children are being overwhelmed with iron. And why is that important? Because too much iron overwhelms copper metabolism. And that's the sterling work of Jamie Collins at the University of Florida here in the States. He's done pioneering work in 2016, 17, 18, 19, studying the dynamics between the copper and iron, especially under supplemental iron conditions. Well, the average practitioner doesn't know about that research. And it's, to me, one of the greatest gaps in their knowledge is they don't understand that not only is there copper metabolism and iron metabolism, they're actually joined at the hip. They're one metabolism, but it's never taught that way. And that's the real breakdown in nutritional education for doctors, if they even get any nutritional education.
Yeah, that's super fascinating because we don't hear about copper. And so what you're saying is, okay, people go to their doctor, they get a blood test, and then the blood test says your iron is low, so you need to supplement with iron. And what you're saying is the blood test is not, even though it's so common to use, it's not a representative picture of what's really going on with iron in the body, because iron is actually being stored in the tissues. And so you could have a lot of iron stored in your tissues, which is not something we want.
Right.
And right, like we want it to be mobilized and we want it to circulate in the blood. We want it to recycle itself. And in order to do that, it needs copper, which is why you're saying iron and copper, go together. So I guess the tricky part is like, then maybe someone would think, oh, okay, so are you saying that if we need to supplement with iron, we should also be supplementing with copper? It seems as though the road of supplementation is a slippery slope, because you're tugging something, and then you have to, all these things fall down. It's,
Right. Well, I think what people need to understand is that in 1941, there was a decision made. I'm not sure by who. It's a fact that it started. And this information is laid out in a book called Iron, the Most Toxic Element, written by an iron toxicologist. I think the book was published in 2007. His name was Jim, J-Y-M, Moon, like the satellite. But what he points out in this book is that in 1941, Britain, Canada, and the United States started adding iron filings to the food system, to the flour, to the wheat flour. Well, now it's worldwide. And for those that think that's not possible, it is a fact. And it's not organic iron, it's inorganic. It means it has no good properties about it. And yet, even with that iron fortification, people are still anemic. Well, the reason why they're anemic is that there's no attention being given to the general, copper. And again, there's a complete gap in the practitioner's mindset. I've talked with scores of physicians over the last 12 years, and I've asked them point blank, how many times did you hear the word copper in your training? That many times.
Yeah.
And it's really the reason why we're here on the planet, why higher life forms are here, why we're having a very engaging conversation on fancy equipment, is it takes higher levels of intelligence to make these devices possible. In order to have higher intelligence, you have to have higher levels of energy. Mm-hmm. Well, that is only made possible by the ability to oxidize glucose and fat. Well, that process requires copper. It's absolutely essential inside the mitochondria. And that metabolic bedrock of information isn't taught in doctor school. And so when people say, well, maybe I should just take some copper along with my iron, actually, you're probably better off just focusing on the copper and let the iron get out of your cells and back into the recycling system. That's where the mistake is being made, is that people think, oh, well, I'll just do both. You don't really need both. And that's really what the root cause protocol is designed to do, is take advantage of the stored iron and mobilize it and put it back to work.
Mm-hmm. So the root cause protocol is a protocol designed by Morely to help increase your energy. I mean, to help you produce energy in a really optimal way, because you've got enough copper to help mobilize the iron, and that way iron is not being stuck in the tissues. And then there's also a magnesium component in there that will cover. But I do want to mention that root cause protocol. I don't think most people listening to this will be familiar with it yet.
Yeah. That's fine.
But
You
yeah,
have to say it in Spanish.
yeah, exactly. We need to get it in Spanish.
How do we say root cause protocol in Spanish?
I mean, el protocolo de la raíz, de la raíz del problema or de la causa. I mean, I would have to sit with it and think about what sounds good, because root cause protocol is nice. But yes, the idea is that we're going to the root cause, like la causa, la raíz del desbalance, of the problem, the root cause. Okay, so one thing that I wanted to ask you, because, okay, we're talking about iron, copper, and magnesium, and people will say those are minerals. Sometimes then we talk about iron being a metal, and then we also use the word iron as an element. So although the question may seem basic, what is the difference between an element, a metal, and a mineral?
Great question. So there are, I guess, maybe 92 elements on the planet. Most of them are minerals, and some of them are metals. And you're asking a wonderful question. What's the difference between a mineral and a metal? I'm not even trying to know. But the metals have unique properties in terms of their interaction and their ability to stimulate change inside the cell. Mm-hmm. What makes copper and iron especially unique is they are called, the official scientific term is, they're called redox active metals. Now, what does that mean? Redox is referring to reduction and oxidation, and those are chemical reactions where electrons are being moved from one component to another and back and forth. And what affects that cycle of reduction and activation is what's happening to oxygen inside the tissue. Everything on the planet hinges on the state of oxygen inside our body. Mm-hmm. No one realizes that. And what's fascinating is that all of the really powerful chemicals that we might know about, the hormones, the neurotransmitters, the things that people, they've heard about, dopamine or serotonin or adrenaline, thyroid hormone, things like that. All of those chemicals are all in response to how well is oxygen being managed inside the body. It's absolutely amazing. And so if oxygen is off, that's going to affect our chemical status inside our body, inside the cells. And so like I said, there's 90 some elements, and the vast majority of them are minerals. Well, I think there are only 3 that we really need to focus on. We need more magnesium. We need more bioavailable copper. And when I say bioavailable, what makes copper bioavailable and very unique is its need to be loaded into key enzymes. And that requires the action of retinol and its metabolite, retinoic acid. And then the third area of focus, we need less iron in our tissue. Again, we are swimming in iron, And we're absolutely desert-like conditions with copper. And that's not my opinion. I mean, I've witnessed it in thousands and thousands of consults, but it's the opinion of the brightest minds studying copper and iron on the planet. And those are the people that I follow. Those are the people whose research I really focus in on to really understand this dynamic. And a lot of people are always anxious to know, oh, what's new? Morely, what's new? And what I've learned to ask, based on a very important conversation I had with a famed nutritional consultant, he said, I've learned to ask, what's enduring? Well, these minerals and these metals have been on this planet since the beginning, and it goes all the way back. And it's very important to understand that, understand their relationship with oxygen, but understand that at the very base of it is all organisms, all living organisms want to make energy.
Mhm.
And what's very clear is that you've got to have copper regulating the oxygen and the iron to make sure that energy is optimized in the body. That's the key.
That makes sense. Life wants to live. Like life wants to be life, and life wants to be vibrant life. And in order to do that, there has to be energy. And in order to make energy, we need copper, because copper is part of how we're managing both oxygen and iron in the body.
Right?
And then you mentioned the retinol, which is important for the function of copper. So I think we could talk about retinol because, and I know that we still haven't touched on magnesium, but I want to talk about retinol because
Sure.
as far as I understand, there are no plant-based sources of retinol. And this is where we start talking about diet and how important
Right.
a diet, an omnivorous diet is for humans.
Right. Yeah, I mean, a lot of confusion about the difference between beta carotene, which is found in vegetable life,
Mhm.
and retinol, which is found in animal life.
Mhm.
There's something called retinol, retinol, retinol equivalency units. They're called REUs. What takes 12 beta carotene to equal 1 retinol. Retinol is a very powerful chemical in and of itself. And it has particular importance as it relates to the movement of electrons, the function of light inside our cells and inside our tissue. And no one's thinking about retinol because we're all being inundated with information about vitamin D.
Mhm.
And these fat-soluble vitamins are very, very important, but they're never done in isolation of one another. Vitamin A and vitamin D are a real 1-2 act inside the body.
Mhm.
But in nature, vitamin A is always more prevalent than vitamin D.
Mhm.
Well, again, let's go back to Mother Nature. She must have a reason for that. And no one's talking about that. Everyone's being trained to think that only vitamin D runs the immune system. That's simply not true. The role that retinol plays is, I would say, is 100 times more important, but that's almost heretical to say that in this day and age. But when you begin, to me, the real differentiator is, again, I'm all about energy, producing energy. I'm not worried about the enemies. I really do not worry about that because I know that our immune system requires 2 key components. It needs energy It means intelligence.
Mhm.
And what does copper provide? Energy and intelligence. And so I look at it from an energetic standpoint. Well, retinol plays an immensely important role in moving electrons inside our mitochondria. Very few people know that. It's something called the signalosome. We're getting into some real fascinating areas of physiology. But the important thing is, what role does vitamin D play in the mitochondria? None. Absolutely none. And in fact, I could point you to articles that say that vitamin D will tank the mitochondria. And that's important for people to know. The vitamin D will tank potassium inside the cell. And what does that do? Well, when you take potassium out of the cell, it makes it easier for iron to get in.
Mhm.
And again, people are being trained to think that iron is their friend. It's not. It's not that iron is bad. It's that iron that is absent its regulator is bad. So picture, let's say you had a 4-year-old child, Katie.
Mhm.
I'm just curious to know how you might respond to this. But let's say you have a 4-year-old child and you give them a hammer, and then you go next door to visit your neighbors and have a cup of coffee. Would you ever do that?
No.
No, no one in their right mind would. Well, iron is a 4-year-old with a hammer inside the body when there's no supervision.
Mhm.
And so that's not the way it's billed in medicine. Katie's she's doing this podcast from her kitchen, and there's some very important appliances in her kitchen. There's a microwave, there's a refrigerator. I'm guessing to the right of you is a stove, or is it behind you?
Yeah, right.
Okay, right there. Okay, right. Okay. Well, in the world of conventional medicine, all of the spotlights are on those steel appliances. They're all made of steel.
Mhm.
And what is steel made of? It's made out of iron,
Iron.
right? So, Katie, when was the last time your stove knew what to cook for dinner? When was the last time your stove knew which pot to get out to cook the food in?
Oh, never.
When was the last time the stove knew how much heat was needed to cook or bake or boil the food?
Never.
Never, right? And so in modern medicine, all the optics are on the iron appliances, but nothing is about the chef. Now, what are chefs? I call them cuisine artists. We spell it right. It's CU hyphen ISINE. That way we see the symbol for copper, because
Mhm.
that CU is a symbol for copper.
Mhm.
And in the world of medicine, there's no mention of the cuisine artist.
Mhm.
It's, I'm sure many of your followers are familiar with the Bible.
Mhm.
Most people around the world have at least heard of the Bible if they haven't had direct experience with reading it. And we know that there's a protagonist in the Bible. We all know who the protagonist is.
Mhm.
Well, in the world of medicine, there's another Bible, and it's called the Merck Manual. And there's 32,000 problems and conditions and diseases described in the Merck Manual. But there's no mention of the protagonist called copper. And that's what's wrong with medicine today, is there's no true understanding of how the body regulates itself. And so all of the focus is put on iron, 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 with no regard for the fact that there is a regulator for iron called copper. It's not my theory. I mean, the greatest minds, going back to David Kyland and Otto Warburg and Conrad LVM. These were the pioneering minds back in the 1920s and 30s, but all the way up to the present day. Leslie Clavet and Jamie Collins, who I mentioned, and people of that stature all know this, but that truth is not being taught. The research is there. It's not being hidden. The information is readily available. Got to know what questions to ask. That's the key. But the research is there. It's just not being shared in the classroom or clinical setting. That's the problem.
So what are sources of copper? So, okay, we know we need copper for iron management and energy management. We know we need retinol for copper to function. So then the question becomes like, okay, where do we get copper and retinol in the diet? Let's just talk about food for now, because I know, okay, there's so many different people and maybe there's different access, some people can access supplements more than others or whatever, but just diet wise, where are we getting copper and retinol, and why aren't we eating those foods in abundance in modern times?
Great question. Copper is ultimately found in the soil. Mm-hmm. And when it's in the soil, it can get into the grass and get into the produce and get into the animals. Because animals are designed to eat grass for the most part. And all of that's changed. So when they started using NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, people didn't know that was blocking the uptake of copper. No. But a very famous biochemist, Andre Voisin, Voisin, in 1957, chronicled that very fact, that the NPK was blocking copper. And that was in the 50s. 1957 was when he wrote that book. Well, then 40 years later, the world is being decimated by Roundup, by glyphosate. Glyphosate is a perfect chelator for copper down to a pH of 1. What does that mean? It means that copper doesn't stand a chance to get into the root system. But historically, to answer your question, Katie, our ancestors would have benefited from foods, nuts and seeds historically have been good sources of copper. Oysters and mollusks in seafood, very good source of copper. Grains, historically, grains have been an enormously rich source of copper, along with a lot of other nutrients, of course. But in an era where the grains are being processed, fortified with iron, being manipulated, the metals are not able to survive that. And historically, probably one of the richest sources of copper has been grass-fed beef liver. Going back thousands of years, our ancestors knew that animals that were naturally eating grass were able to, what's in that grass is vitamin C and beta carotene. And the magic of the animal's body is turning that grass into very copper-rich organs, especially the liver, because that's where copper and retinol are stored in the animal's liver, yours and mine included. And it's been the mainstay of human diet for millennia, is to have organ meats, especially liver, on a regular basis. I grew up eating organ meats as a child. Put my foot down at brain. I couldn't do that, but I could eat just about everything else. And the thing is that people, as a rule, don't do that now. In fact, what's happened is our ancestors used to eat organ meats, and they fed the muscle meats to the dogs. Well, that's flipped. Now we eat the muscle meats, and the organ meats are given to the dogs. In fact, I was talking with a client just last week, and they actually buy dog food and eat that because it's organ meats. I was just like, I said, that's a novel approach. She said, well, it seems to work. I feel better. So I think there's a lot of flip-flopping that's going on. But if you're looking for copper, the best sources historically have been bee pollen is actually a good source. You can't pollinate a flower, and you can't pollinate an animal without copper. It's physically impossible. So copper is very important in that. Foods that are rich in vitamin C, your peppers, a lot of and the legumes have also been very, very rich with copper. But the vitamin C molecule has been completely altered over the last 100 years. Well, actually 90 years, maybe 85 years. But the thing is, most people don't know that. So the vitamin C has an enzyme called tyrosinase. Well, that tyrosinase enzyme is very, very important because it has 2 copper atoms inside it and plays instrumental roles inside our body. And then we're back to the grass-fed organ meats. What my wife and I were, it'd been years since we'd seen the documentary King Corn. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to watch it. It's a wonderful documentary about where is corn in our modern food system. Mm-hmm. And it's everywhere. Okay. Absolutely everywhere. And what is corn? It's a giant form of grass, but that doesn't mean it's good for us. Mm-hmm. And so animals for millennia ate grass. And now what are they eating? Corn and soybean. Mm-hmm. And it's not just natural corn and soybean, it's modified, GMO modified corn and soybean, which is a manipulated diet, which alters their digestive system, which really it's devastating to their copper and iron metabolism. Nobody's thinking about that. And so there's a lot of changes that have been made in the food system. And what it really requires is knowing farmers, getting food directly from farmers or going to farmers markets and having the courage to ask them, so how are you feeding the soil? What are you doing to nourish the fungus and the bacteria that are doing all the work to mineralize the produce and ultimately mineralize the animals? Mm-hmm. Those are fun conversations. Mm-hmm. Suddenly the farmer will start talking about the weather when they don't want you to know what they're really doing. Yeah. But that's what we need to do is have those meaningful conversations. And when you step into a supermarket, only shop the perimeter. Because if your food is coming from a box, a can, the frozen food section, or your car window, it's not really food. Mm-hmm. Looks like food, but it's not really food. And so the access to minerals is going to be richest when it's naturally grown and naturally harvested. And that's a a dying concept on this planet, unfortunately.
So liver is important as and we're talking specifically about beef liver. Beef liver is an important source of copper, but it's also a source of retinol, which I want to make clear, retinol is vitamin A. That when we say retinol, we're talking about vitamin A. So it almost seems as though if you're not going to do anything else, eat liver.
Yeah, but it needs to be grass-fed and grass-finished. Best if you can find a local farmer who can supply it for you. And we live in an era now where the internet is full of warnings about copper toxicity and retinol or vitamin A toxicity. By now, 2 years into this world-changing event that we've been experiencing, people need to be more alert and more discerning to know that maybe what they're telling me isn't the truth.
Right.
If someone's talking about copper toxicity and vitamin A toxicity, you can just thank them for their concern and go about your way because you know better. But we've really got to challenge this constant programming to get us fearful of this and that. The things that we're supposed to be fearful of are the ones that are probably the most important for our health and well-being.
Right. And also with what's happening around the world, most people in the alternative health world have said, absolutely, you need to be taking vitamin D. Vitamin D, which is a fat-soluble vitamin, just like vitamin A or retinol. Vitamin D is the one that you said before, it gets all the attention. And a lot of people are supplementing big amounts of vitamin D, but they're not thinking or talking at all about vitamin A. And it does seem concerning, the consumption of vitamin D in supplement form, because it's very, very, very much touted as something that everybody should be doing.
Oh, it is. And again, if they're telling us to go left, we should have the good sense and discernment now to know to go right. So I've been speaking out against vitamin D only supplements for almost 12 years now. And there's for those who really want to take a deeper dive, within the root cause protocol website, rcp123.org, there's a resources tab, and within the resources tab is access to material called master classes. And one of the master classes is on vitamin D. It's about a 90-minute presentation, and it will introduce you to information you've never heard before, that in fact there's a dark side to vitamin D. And it's a very significant dark side, because what people always talk about is, sunlight is so important for making vitamin D. That's true, right? Well, what most people don't know is that these fat-soluble vitamins, especially A and D, come in a storage form and an active form. That's important to know. And as my good friend Jim Stevenson Jr. says, something that's a storage form is supposed to be in storage. It's not supposed to be in the blood. And when a storage form of a chemical like vitamin D is showing up in high doses in the blood, that means there's tremendous stress taking place in the liver. People are just not thinking it through. And this idea that, if I get my D up to 80 to 100, then I don't have to worry about this condition or that condition. Well, all those studies are based on correlation, not causation.
Mhm.
Important question. Do flies cause garbage?
No, they're just around.
No. Do firemen cause fires?
No.
Do skid marks cause accidents?
Mm.
No, but they're all highly correlated. And so the confusion is that when people are sick, their vitamin D is low. But the question that's not being asked is, why is my vitamin D low? And it's fascinating. The enzyme to make the storage form of vitamin D requires magnesium. Oh, we're back to that magnesium thing again. So when we're under stress, guess what leaves the body very quickly? It's called magnesium.
Mhm.
Well, then that enzyme doesn't work right. And it begs the question, why does magnesium keep leaving my body? Because when you're eating a diet that's low in copper, iron starts to fill up in the liver,
Mhm.
right under your right rib cage. How long have they known that? For 100 years. So when they lower copper, it increases iron accumulation in the liver.
Mhm.
Well, what's the liver? It's the battery that runs our body. It's an incredibly important organ. And if there's a buildup of iron and magnesium have a very torturous relationship. If iron is high, magnesium is going to be low.
Mhm.
When magnesium's low, the vitamin D is going to be low. And that's what's going to cause the storage form of the vitamin D to go low. And what the doctor's not thinking about is, well, what's the impact of all that iron inside the liver? That's going to create all sorts of confusion around cholesterol, triglyceride metabolism, lipid metabolism. The fats can't get burned properly. That's then going to affect insulin resistance. And there's just this chain reaction of all that iron inside the liver. No one's thinking about that
Yeah.
because we're all anemic and we need
Mhm.
more iron. And it's actually a very simple mechanism of the dynamic between the copper and the
Mhm.
iron is critical inside our body. And if people are being trained to focus on vitamin D, well, then they're not being taught about vitamin A. But it turns out that it's absolutely true. When you're in sunlight, it does increase the synthesis of vitamin D. That's a
Mhm.
good thing. But what does it also do? It increases the breakdown of vitamin A. And vitamin A needs to become its metabolites, needs to become the retinoic acids, which are hormones in and of their own right, but it
Mhm.
also needs to become what are called nuclear receptors. There's a whole series of nuclear receptors that are critical for normal communication at the genetic level, and they're called RARs, RORs, RXRs, RZRs. You can't make this stuff up. Well, there's about 40 of them. There's different nuclear receptors. And if they're not there, the body doesn't work right. Genes don't
Mhm.
work right. Metabolism is completely at a standstill.
Mhm.
And it turns out everyone thinks that vitamin D walks on water. Well, you need to know what the real story is. It isn't the storage form, it's the active form. So again, there's a storage form and an active form. The active form is actually made in the kidneys,
Mhm.
and it's another magnesium-dependent enzyme. But the active form needs to be hooked up with something called the vitamin D receptor. which is magnesium dependent. And then the third leg of the stool is called RXR, retinoid X receptor. And those three working together is what enhances immune function and production of components to help the immune system. But people are not being taught that. They're just told, get your vitamin D up. And taking a supplemental form of vitamin D is not necessarily going to increase that threefold function that's so important for the immune system. And so there's just a wholesale misunderstanding of who's really in control. And the party line is it's iron and vitamin D. And the truth of the matter is it's copper and retinol. And the third component that I would introduce here is and fat. I think.
Oh, wait. Oh, the screen froze for a second. You said the third component that you would introduce here is fat, you said?
Is sugar versus fat.
Oh, sugar versus fat.
Yeah. And what most people don't realize is that there's a relationship between iron and sugar, just as there's a relationship between copper and fat. The minute you start introducing more sugar into your diet, which has been the mainstay of food around the world for the last 60 years, you're going to increase the amount of iron in your metabolism. And most people worldwide eat what's called a low-fat diet because we were taught back in the 50s and 60s that fat was causing heart disease. A big fat lie. Gary Taubes and many other, Gerald Reaven and many other famous scientists have challenged that successfully to the point where the practitioners know that's not true, but the public is still burning off that belief system. And so in order to bring fat into in order to bring copper into your body, you've got to have fat in your diet. But in order to metabolize that fat, you have to have copper in your tissues. So it's a very important relationship between copper and fat versus iron and sugar. And the initial understanding of this goes back to the early 1900s in Germany. And all the famous scientists back then were really studying the metabolism of carbohydrates, especially the sugars, and they had tremendous insight about this back then. All that very significant and esoteric knowledge has been lost to the ages, but it's a very important piece of the puzzle for people to understand is that what you want is a high-fat, moderate protein diet that's going to be very mineral rich. That's really what you're seeking. And the shorthand for that is an ancestral diet. If you go into the ancestral foods in Mexico and South America and Spain, they're very rich sources of copper and fat that have been lost to the modern era. And that's what people need to go back to.
I mean, I can definitely speak for Peru. The general, because Peru has so many grains and tubers, like their diet wasn't necessarily a high fat diet or a high fat moderate protein. Now there are definitely myths out there about, well, what really was an Andean diet, because also Peru has the coast, there's lots of seafood, and the Andes, and there's more like potatoes and potatoes and other roots. and grains. And then the jungle has lots of wild foods and some fish and things, and lots of yucca and lots of banana and whatever. But it certainly wasn't as high of a fat diet as like an Inuit diet. I mean, in terms of ancestral diets, it was definitely less fat and more carb, but they still did have nutrient dense foods. I mean, when ancestral people knew that you eat the whole animal and that you eat the fish eggs and you eat the eyeballs and you eat all these parts. So even if you're not eating that many animal products or that much fat, you're getting the most out of what you're eating because you're eating these really nutrient parts.
Exactly. Absolutely true. And again, to me, the nutritional bedrock of information is the research that Weston A. Price and his wife Florence did back in the 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
Seminal understanding of 14 different communities around the world to document. And Dr. Price, when he set out on that journey, he was convinced that people with perfect teeth would have a low-fat diet,
mm-hmm.
and they would be pretty much protein-free. They would be vegetarian. And what he was surprised to find out is that in all 14 communities where they documented the diet, they were all eating protein, whether it was ants in Africa or whale blubber in Alaska. And the amount of fat in the diet was upwards of 60 to 70% of the calories were coming from fat. Well, that's unheard of in the modern era. That disproportionate amount of fat is the average person today would be shocked at what their ancestors were eating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Weston A. Price I have a lot of resources about him because it's the reason why I started my whole project. So it's amazing. And yeah, it's of course, the ancestral diets are going to be different depending on where you are in the world. Some are higher fat, some are lower fat, some are higher protein, some are slightly lower, some have more seafood, some have less seafoods, but there are principles that unite all of these diets, and their nutrient dense animal foods were a part of all of the diets. And Dr. Price is really amazing because he was talking about fat soluble vitamins. He was talking about A, D, and K2. I mean, this was almost 100 years ago that he was saying.
But what I think we can safely say is that the Western diet, the modern Western diet, is not a sustainable source of nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
It's an easy statement to make.
So I think about, because so much of what I find so important in the world is that we learn these things about what you're teaching about iron and copper and retinol and what Dr. Price teaches. We need to know these things to heal our bodies so that we're able to give birth to healthy babies, because it has to do with the regeneration of our species, of humans. And so I do think that what you said earlier about women, when they're pregnant, they're naturally going to have lower iron levels. I think a lot of women are prescribed iron supplements, and then the baby is born, and then the baby is having iron fortified formula and vitamin D fortified formula. So all of those things are a little bit, I feel depressed because I'm thinking, what are we supposed to do? What are we there? Because it's like you said, even midwives, a lot of people just assume that if you see a midwife, she's going to be alternative. And no, I mean, I went to a midwifery course last year and they were talking about iron, and they totally were into iron supplements. So there's so few people talking about this, and it's hard to, let's say you're a woman who's pregnant and they say, okay, you don't have enough iron, you need to supplement, otherwise it's going to be bad for your baby. It would be hard to hear that from someone in a white coat and then not do it. So
Right.
I don't know. I feel a little like, sometimes I feel a little bit bummed or majorly bummed about the world.
It's very frustrating.
Yeah.
Again, for the benefit of the audience, I was a biology major in college. I was interested in science, but I didn't pursue it as a career until about 12 years ago. And then I took a really deep dive, and it was really around wanting to understand what is really happening.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the instrumental, it was the frozen shoulder and what Dr. Liz said, but it was a book that my son had given me about history here in the States. And the title of the book is called Lies My Teacher Told Me. And it's written by a wonderful professor of history at the University of Vermont. And when he handed it to me, he said, Dad, I can't read it. It's too upsetting. I said, oh, he said, I think you might find it interesting. And I dove right into the book. I was fascinated by the fact that so much of the history we know here in the States is not really true. It's a storybook version. It's like Walt Disney was in charge. And that's probably true worldwide. But it got me to the point where I began to question, well, I wonder if they lied to us about history, could they be lying to us about medicine? Could they be lying to us about nutrition? And that's what really piqued my curiosity. And I've never looked back, because it became this fascination with what's the party line versus what's the truth. And what most folks don't realize is that most of the nutritional principles that they hold near and dear are based on research that's based on correlation, again, skid marks causing accidents, not the fact that it's not true at all. It isn't just that they're related, it's that there's a causal reason. And what I began to uncover, again, I didn't discover it, I just happened to codify it, or at least document it, where all these researchers around the world, they were exposing the fact that when iron and oxygen don't play well together, they create what's called oxidative stress. And oxidative stress really messes up minerals, especially, but they also mess up the energy production. Well, when energy production gets messed up, it affects metabolic pathways, which then cause symptoms to appear.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there is no disease. It doesn't really exist as a concept, but there is metabolic dysfunction inside our tissue. The cells are not making energy properly. They're not able to respire. They're not able to work with the oxygen. And when that happens, that creates this downstream crescendo of events that are interpreted as disease, but there is no disease. It's just oxygen and iron and copper are not working together the way they're supposed to.
So oxidative stress is caused by lack of copper? Is that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Are there other reasons for oxidative stress?
Well, they'll tell you, oh, there's dozens of reasons.
Uh-huh.
There's not. There's one. If the oxygen molecule is not being activated inside the mitochondria, and that can only happen when there's a lack of bioavailable copper, then that event affects the cell's ability to generate energy. And once there's a wobble in the energy production, there's just a downstream cascade of events. And it's all keying off of energy production. To me, what I've learned, Katie, is that when we have stress in our world, and you and all your listeners have stress, we know that. When we have stress in our world, we have oxidative stress in our body. Because under stress, we lose magnesium very quickly. If the stress is chronic, like the last 2 years, we're going to lose access to copper. When those two minerals are lost to our metabolism, energy production plummets. And if you can't make energy, then you can't resolve the stress. The best definition I've ever come across for stress was by Mark Hyman, very famous functional doctor at Cleveland Clinic. And this is the quotation. Stress is the body's inability to make energy for the mind to respond to its environment. That's what stress is. That the tension between our ability to produce energy to respond and our body's inability to make that happen. And when there's that conflict, it just grinds through our minerals. And so there is no disease. There is stress-induced mineral disruption and dysregulation. And that's what's important for people to understand, is that when people find out that it's a mineral deficiency or mineral dysregulation, well, that's solvable because we can change our diet. But when you hear a disease label or it gets tattooed on your forehead and you think you're broken, well, we're not broken. But we are undernourished. And the phrase that I use is we are misled and we are misfed. And that's been ruling the planet now for about 100 years. This campaign of miseducating the public and miseducating the practitioners has been a century-long campaign of confusion. And we can see the results of it right now. It's right in our face. And we can't escape it now.
When you say that we lose magnesium under stress right away, and we lose copper if stress becomes chronic, which is so everybody but where do we urinate it out? Is
Yes,
that?
Absolutely. There's a whole series of enzymes called kinase enzymes, Kinase, and those enzymes are designed that when we're under stress, they're going to cleave a phosphate off of a component. And when that phosphate leaves the component, magnesium is lost to our waste product, to our urine. And so, yeah, we do pee it out very quickly, just like we pee out the B vitamins as well. The chronic side is that when we're under chronic stress, cortisol increases the production of a protein called metallothionein 4 to 5-fold. And what does metallothionein do? It binds up copper 1,000 times stronger than it binds up zinc. Well, then you've effectively taken copper offline and it's not available for energy production. And that the other side of it is that not only is copper instrumental for creating energy, it's critical for clearing the exhaust, the oxidative stress. And there's a whole network of antioxidant enzymes that are all run by copper, ceruloplasmin, superoxide dismutase, glutathione peroxidase, catalase. There are many enzymes inside the body that must have copper in order to do their function. And the way I describe it very simply is we've all worked with a flashlight. And what happens when you take the batteries out of a flashlight? They don't work. And what people have never been taught is that copper is the battery that runs our flashlight. Very simple function. And it's not, there's no focus scientifically or clinically outside of the research studies. It's not taught in practitioner school, unfortunately.
Well, what's interesting is that it's pretty mainstream to know that magnesium is important for stress management. I've heard people talk about magnesium for energy production. A lot of people in Latin America take magnesium as a supplement. I don't know what kind they're taking. It's probably magnesium citrate. But yeah, it's very popular. Like in Peru, there's a product called magnesio. Lots of people know about magnesium, but no one's talking about copper. Do you think it would be, could it be detrimental if you just take magnesium and you're not?
No, it's not going to be detrimental. The way I describe it, Katie, is that magnesium is good at correcting symptoms. And it's a constant process of having to take magnesium in order to stay on top of the aches and pains and discomfort and this and that. You want to solve the problem that's creating the magnesium loss, you've got to correct the imbalance between copper and iron, which is going to involve copper and retinol in order to make sure that the copper is bioavailable and will activate the enzymes that regulate iron activity. And so it's a very different approach. It's much more strategic by focusing on the copper and retinol. But the magnesium, it's wonderful, but it's like the difference between bailing a boat that has a leak and fixing the hole in the boat. That's the difference. And I think we need to do both, to be honest.
So I know we have the root cause protocol, but because in Spanish it's not as accessible yet, I would say I would say, so what can we leave people with? Okay, we can leave takeaways such as, hey, there's way more to the story than just you don't have enough iron and you're anemic. Okay, there's way more to the story. We know copper needs to be involved. So we talked about sources of copper being bee pollen and beef liver. What about other kinds of liver? What about, could people go ahead and start taking magnesium? What kind of magnesium? Like, what are maybe 3 or 4, like, here's what you can do now. And then, here's what you can do now. And then as more information about the root cause protocol gets translated to the Spanish, we can share that with the world and people can be a little bit more educated about exactly what the process is, which also, I want to say this too, it's not like you're having people do weird, like hugely big, major things. It's like very certain specific things. I think that's important because sometimes people can get into this whole world of supplements and they end up having like 20 bottles they have to take all the time. It's the same paradigm as Western medicine, just like, oh, I have this problem, this pill will fix it, which
exactly. So the real focal point of the protocol are what are called stops and starts. Stop doing this, start doing that.
Mhm.
And I think what we probably a really good outcome of this conversation, given your interest in helping to further awareness of this, is to translate the stops and starts into Spanish.
Mm.
That would be pretty easy to do. Again, I think the audience has figured out I don't speak Spanish, and I apologize for that. I know Latin, I know French, but I do not know Spanish. I mean, I can fumble my way around, but you wouldn't want to hear me have a conversation with Katie. It would be a very uncomfortable situation. But the thing is, the stops and starts are pretty clear. But I think what's going to surprise people is the area of focus. And we tell people, stop taking iron supplements. Stop taking calcium supplements. Stop taking ascorbic acid. We're very prescriptive about what you need to stop doing. And what's amazing is the number of people who feel better just by stopping the components that they think are good for them, when in fact they're not good for you. And then begin to focus on the things that are good for you, like making sure that you're getting the bioavailable copper that Katie's focusing on, getting real vitamin C, getting good sources of retinol in your diet. And I think with very limited effort, if you're getting good sources of minerals for the water that you drink and cook with, that would be a real important starting point. Make sure you do have magnesium in your diet, because when your body needs the magnesium, but it also helps to calm you down.
Mhm.
Again, a body that's deficient in magnesium overreacts to the stress that it's confronting. So
Mhm.
increasing magnesium, and it's 10 milligrams per kilo body weight. So if someone weighs 100 kilograms, they would need 1,000 milligrams of magnesium. But the
What
thing,
kind of magnesium?
well, the ones that that we find the best results with are magnesium malate and magnesium glycinate. And we're now working with a form that's called magnesium bisglycinate, and that seems to be well received as well. I think when you go into the RCP, you'll see the ones that we encourage people not to take. And it might be ones that you're already taking. We just encourage you to be open to making a change. But minerals in general, being able to support the magnesium would be key. Doing what we call the adrenal cocktails, which are what they do is provide vitamin C and sodium and potassium, and really help to nourish the adrenal glands that are really taking it on the chin with all the stress that we're under, but then beginning to introduce the copper and the retinol is very, very important. And that's a very doable starting point. What we've got are about 12 different components, but at some point you've got to start somewhere, and that would be a great place to start. And just to get people to stop doing the things that are working against their health and well-being would be a tremendous step forward. And then to begin to introduce these other components around the minerals and the magnesium and the copper and the retinol and vitamin C would be fantastic.
Mm-hmm. And eat liver. Like,
well, yeah, no, it's again, a lot of people around the world are eating desiccated beef liver, but that doesn't mean it's got the copper in it. There, to my knowledge, there's no manufacturer of desiccated beef liver that tells you what the nutrient composition is after it's been dried. That's what desiccation means. They dried out the tissue, and no one measures the nutrient content. So we don't really know what we're taking. We know what it was before desiccation, which is helpful, but I'm not sure it's the full truth. And so what we've done within the RCP is develop a form of copper supplement called Recuperate. And what it's based on is desiccated beef liver, spirulina, some turmeric, and then 2 milligrams of copper bisglycinate, just to make sure people are getting the copper that they need for their metabolic processes. Very, very important.
Yeah, the whole kind of beef liver and pills and capsules that I haven't really seen that too much in Latin America, but people do have access to liver that they can just, cook on the stove and then they can eat it. So that's good. And that's interesting what you're saying, that, what's the nutrient profile after drying, after the desiccation process. Is copper in any way heat sensitive or water sensitive?
No, not that I'm aware of. But I think what's the real key issue is the copper in the soil? Is it getting into the grass? Is it getting into the cow's liver? That's the question. Those are the questions that need to be asked of the farmer who's supplying the source of liver for your pills, or even for your liver for your dinner. Again, it's got to be organic, and they've got to understand that there needs to be support of the soil in order to get those minerals into the produce and the animal tissue.
A lot of people are talking about regenerating. I mean, these farmers call themselves soil farmers. So they understand all of that, but they're not necessarily talking about copper. It would be interesting to find a farmer, maybe, who knows what specific practices would increase copper in the soil or make it more biodegradable, or maybe just any kind of, all of these regenerative agriculture techniques can bring up copper because they're making all the minerals more available. I don't know, but I guess it's just interesting because that's really where it starts. And I don't this information is just as important, if not more so, for farmers to hear.
Absolutely.
But I don't know farmers talking about copper.
No, again, traditionally, agronomists aren't going to focus on copper alone. And the reason why I'm focusing on it is I understand what happens to the human body when there's no copper. It falls apart. So, in terms of the economy, if you take gold out of the economy collapses. These fancy computers that you and I are talking on, if you take silver out of the motherboard, it stops working. They don't work. And in humans, you take copper out of the metabolic pathways of our body, then you're back to the Merck manual. You're back to 32,000 different ways of describing a breakdown. And I think it's time for the public to understand that it's that straightforward and it's that simple. And there is a well understood impact that restricting copper in our diet has on our physiology. I would never have believed it, Katie, if I hadn't uncovered this in the last 12 years. I didn't know any of this. But when you begin to see study after study after study, and what's amazing, absolutely amazing, is the number of studies out there. Well, what happens if we take copper out here? Or what if it happens if we take it out here? I've yet to find a study. I'd love to find one study that says, well, what happens when we supplement copper? How does the animal improve its health? I've yet to find that study. And so I think it's time for people to realize that there's a very subtle hand in the research that's constantly taking copper out of the equation, and it's affecting the quality of our food, which is ultimately affecting the quality of our health.
Mhm. Yeah, it is. There's
Over
so much.
it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much work to be done, but at the same time, I will say sometimes I definitely am in awe of the resiliency of the human body. Like even though we have all of these deficiencies starting in the soil, in the plants, in the animals, in our bodies, at the same time, we are resilient. I mean, the human body is so able to adapt and to just get by without enough. But obviously we're talking about not just surviving, but also thriving. And we're talking about regeneration of not just the soil, but of all of the beings that depend on the soil for our nourishment. So we're talking about regeneration of the earth and of humanity. And it's really beautiful. And you're right. It doesn't have to be as complicated as we make it to be. It's not that complicated. I mean, it's a lot, but it's not that complicated.
No, it's not. It's understanding where the real area of emphasis is.
Mm-hmm.
And copper is the Achilles heel of the human being.
Mm-hmm.
If copper is low, especially in the pregnant woman's body, it's going to affect the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
So what most people don't know is that the average adult has a liver. You and I have a liver that has about 7 milligrams of copper. That's just a tiny little bit. Very important, but that's about all we have. But when you and I were born, assuming we were born to healthy moms, we were born with livers that had 70 milligrams of copper. And what's supposed to happen is that concentration of copper in the liver, coupled with the breast milk that we're supposed to get from mom, which is very rich in retinol, well, that copper, that retinol, formed the basis of our immune system for the first 2 years of life. Well, it's very hard to do that in a modern era where the optics and the focus is all about vitamin D and iron. It's the exact opposite of what's needed for a healthy immune system.
Mm-hmm.
Nutritional immunity is all built around restricting the amount of iron in our diet so that the pathogens can't get access to iron. Well, what happened? What do you think happened in 1941 when we started putting iron filings into the food system? Nutritional immunity went out the window. It was the mainstay of nutrition for centuries. Restrict the iron in the body. And now everyone thinks they're anemic. And it's not true because they don't understand the difference between low iron in the blood and high iron in the tissue.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the breakdown is. It's a very simple misunderstanding of what does low iron. And here's an interesting observation. All the people that I went to school with in college, who went to medical school, all got A's in calculus. It's a very, at times, very complicated form of mathematics. But they all got A's in it. They're had very good minds when it came to complicated math. And it seems that when they got to medical school, they were all handed a ruler and told that iron is all about high and low. It's not. It's one of the most important, but it's also one of the most complicated aspects of our metabolism. And you don't use a ruler to measure iron status. It involves multiple variables. It's very similar to the calculus that people get in college. And it's a tragedy that these very gifted practitioners who have great hearts, great minds, have been turned into monkeys using a ruler to measure iron status. I think it's a tragedy.
Yeah, it is a tragedy because and because they don't know that they're doing harm. They just think, oh, I have this test, I have the box. Here's what I learned. If people are inside this, they're healthy, and if they're not healthy. And this is what I know, and this is what I know. And and so they're just trying to do their best, but we live in a time where all of us who are seeking answers to our health issues, we take responsibility, and we can't count on being told by a doctor. I'm not discounting all doctors. I'm saying that they're simply guides. They can offer some things, and they can offer some things, and then a lot they can't offer. And it's up to us to really go out and explore, and to look at the past, and also to look at studies, because I think what people need to understand is that Morely has a book. I haven't mentioned that yet, but his book, Cure Your Fatigue, and cure with Cu, copper. Because copper is so important for energy production, as we've talked about for a while. His book has many references, and your online resources, there's so many references. What has been needed is just somebody to step in and to connect the dots with all of these different studies and resources, because some people could listen to this and say, well, I don't believe you, because there's just like one or two people talking about this, and all these doctors are saying something else. So why would I believe you? And there's certainly many studies, and not only that, many experiences of people doing these things to get better, that provide a solid foundation from which you can speak with confidence and say, I really know these things to be true.
No, it's very well said. And Katie, I would never have predicted that this information would be up there. I would never have thought 12 years ago that I would be this spokesman for the truth about copper and iron metabolism. But once I realized what the problem was, I wasn't going to shy away from the work that's needed to change people's understanding of the problem. And I've never worked so hard in my life, but I've never had so much fun either. And it's an absolute delight to be able to have these types of conversations. So a new audience is going to begin to get exposed to this. And for those that are intrigued, we have almost 250,000 people on the Magnesium Advocacy Group Facebook group. It's a very large and vibrant group, very active Telegram group. I mean, there's a lot of different channels that we're speaking in. I've got 200 videos on YouTube talking about different aspects of what Katie and I are describing here. So this is not something that I just suddenly, I woke up this morning and thought I would talk to Katie about this. This has been a long-standing area of focus and passion. And I'm just tickled to be able to share this type of information with the folks who follow you. I think it's great.
Yeah, I think it's great because we definitely need more of this information in Spanish. And so I think that this talk is a nice introduction, and hopefully we piqued people's interest. I'll share in the description of this video, I'll share your book and your website and some other resources and things that I've found. And of course, for now, most of that is in English, but this will be subtitled, and then future things that we do together and some of your work that that we can get pushed out in Spanish. There will be more and more resources in Spanish available for people. And yeah, I think it's really important. So anything I can do to help you is really important for the people who listen to me and their families, because it's information, the truth. I mean, misinformation spreads and so does truth. So there's no stopping it.
And I think the most vulnerable people on the planet right now are the babies inside the womb of women who don't understand what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And there are practitioners, whether they are doulas or midwives or physicians, have not been given a complete set of information. Excuse me, they've not been given a complete set of information about what are the minimal requirements for a healthy newborn. There is an agenda, there's a narrative, but it's not a natural and balanced treatment of what does it require to produce a healthy baby.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's actually one. I mean, I would really like to do another talk with you that's focused specifically on preconception nutrition. Well, preconception, pregnancy, and then early childhood care and postpartum, because that's if we take care of women and men and babies during that time, specifically, I mean, most importantly, maybe women and children, but fathers also have a role in preconception nutrition, of course. If we take care of the family in that beautiful, amazing time period, then we are enabling humanity to reach levels of health that are innately part of who we are destined to be.
Yeah, well, it allows the fullest expression of the human being.
Exactly.
And for those who are readers, there's a wonderful book by Kate with a K. I think it's a K. Shanahan. I should double check that just to make sure I don't want to make a mistake here. But she wrote one. Pardon?
Oh, Deep Nutrition. Is that her book?
Yeah, I think. Why do I think it's a C and I'm saying it's a K? Kate with a C. I'm sorry, Kate with a C. Kate Shanahan, MD. It's Deep Nutrition, and it's an amazing book that builds on the legacy of Dr. Price, Weston A. Price, and she was able to bring it into the modern era. And it's fascinating. I think for those who are really interested in this idea of nutrition helping to shape the physiology and help to shape the well-being of the individual, will find that book fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will also include that in this video's description. And thank you, Morely, for your time, and thank you for all of your work. I'm so grateful for all the twists and turns that your life took to lead you to where you are today, because it's really beautiful to do something in service to the world. I mean, that's why we're here. And so I'm grateful for your path and for your knowledge and for your willingness to share it so generously. It's very inspiring.
Well, it's an absolute delight to do it. As I think we discussed, I'm doing my life's work, feel very good about it. Mm-hmm. And my purpose in life is to help people get over their physical issues, whatever they might be, so they can get on with their purpose in life. Mm-hmm. We're not put on this planet to worry about diabetes and heart disease and cancer and now into a mindset that is not the natural expression of why we're here. So
absolutely.
Happy to do my part.
It's good. And yes, we're all here for an amazing purpose. And so we want to be able to be healthy enough, like you say, to be able to fulfill that purpose. Also understanding that there are great teachings in not being well. And so being unwell, experiencing symptoms, what we usually call disease, is also part of the path as well. And it's all part of this winding road of life, you know?
Dr. Liz and I were with a young family last night, and the husband, the dad, is in his 30s, and he's got a vision problem where it's very hard for him to see. He hasn't lost his vision, but it changed dramatically about 12 years ago. And we're having a very wonderful conversation. I said, I'm just curious, what have you learned about life because of this affliction? And he was very quick to respond. He said, I've learned to have a very deep and fulfilling relationship with God. He said, I don't think I would have gotten there had I not had this problem. I thought that's a beautiful response. I mean, he really, again, would he like to have 100% vision? Of course he would. But he's learned that there's a reason that it came about, but he's really tried to turn lemons into lemonade. And it was a very powerful moment when we were having that conversation.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. Well, Morely, thank you so much. And we will talk to you soon. And I'm excited to start this whole next chapter of Root Cause Protocol in Spanish. It's going to be a good one.
That's great. Well, thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
You too.